In 1938, a British locomotive called the Mallard hit 126 miles per hour, the official world speed record for a steam train. That record still stands today, almost 90 years later. Except there's a problem. Because 3 years after that record was set, a locomotive in Indiana reportedly hit 141 miles per hour. Some say it went even faster, over 150. The Pennsylvania Railroad allegedly got fined for how fast this thing was going, but they never filed the record. They never claimed it. And then, a few years later, they quietly cut the entire locomotive apart for scrap metal. This was the PRRS-1, number 6100, nicknamed the Big Engine. It weighed over 1 million pounds. It was 140 feet long, nearly half a football field. It was wrapped in a streamlined Art Deco shell so futuristic that it looked like it was moving at 100 miles per hour standing still. It was so powerful it could outmuscle a freight locomotive twice its size, and so enormous that the railroad that built it couldn't even use it on most of its own tracks. This is the story of the most ambitious, most excessive, most tragically doomed locomotive ever created, and why everything about it, from its birth to its death, raises the same question. If this machine was really as fast as they say it was, why did no one want you to know? Why did they even build this thing? The Pennsylvania Railroad called themselves the Standard Railroad of the world. Not a standard, the standard. This was the biggest, richest railroad in America, and they had the ego to match. But by the mid-1930s, they had a problem. And the problem was themselves. Their workhorse passenger locomotives, the K4S class, were aging out. And PRR had just introduced something that made the K4S look ancient. The GG1 electric locomotive. The GG1 was smooth, fast, modern. It could cruise at 100 miles per hour without breaking a sweat. Every time a GG1 glided through the electrified East Coast corridor, it made the steam fleet look like a relic. A normal railroad would have said, "Great, let's electrify more track." But the Pennsylvania Railroad was not going to admit that steam was finished. Admitting that meant admitting a century of institutional knowledge, and identity was obsolete. So in June 1936, PRR set an absurd target: build a coal-burning steam engine that could haul a 1,000-ton passenger train at 100 miles per hour on level track. For context, the K4S could barely crack 80 with a heavy train. They went to Baldwin Locomotive Works. Baldwin came back with conventional designs, proven reliable, boring. PRR rejected them. What they wanted was a duplex. The duplex concept was elegant. Instead of one massive engine driving one long set of coupled wheels, you split the power into two separate engines on a single rigid frame. Smaller cylinders, lighter parts, less vibration, more efficiency at high speed. The catch? Nobody had ever built one at this scale. PRR didn't care. In April 1937, the board authorized $300,000, roughly $6.5 million today, and assembled a joint committee from the three biggest locomotive builders in America: Baldwin, the American Locomotive Company, and Lima Locomotive Works. The original plan was a manageable 4-4-4-4 design, but as the engineering progressed, the requirements kept growing: more boiler, more power, more weight. Every time the weight went up, they needed more wheels. The design ballooned into a 6-4-4-6, a wheel arrangement that had never existed before and has never existed since. The S1 is the only one ever built. If you're building the most extreme locomotive in history, you don't hand the exterior design to just anyone. PRR gave it to Raymond Loewy. If you don't know the name, you know the work. The Coca-Cola bottle? Loewy, the Lucky Strike cigarette package, the Greyhound bus and logo. Loewy, the Shell logo, the Exxon logo, the US Postal Service emblem. All Loewy. Air Force One's blue and white livery. Loewy designed that for JFK. When NASA needed someone to design the interior of Skylab, they called Loewy. By 1951, a national magazine wrote that he had probably affected the daily life of more Americans than any other man of his time. And Loewy didn't just sketch the S1. He built a clay-scale model and tested it in a wind tunnel at the Guggenheim Aeronautical Laboratory, the same facility used for actual aircraft. He refined the smoke lifting plates based on aerodynamic data. He wasn't decorating a train. He was applying aerospace engineering to a coal-burning steam engine. The finished locomotive cost $669,780, over $15 million today, more than double the cost of the T1 that would replace it. The cast steel bed plate was the largest single-piece casting ever made for a locomotive. The boiler was nearly the same size as the one on Union Pacific's Big Boy, except the Big Boy was a freight engine. The S1 was built to carry passengers at 100 miles per hour. And in terms of raw power, the S1 was 13% more powerful than the Big Boy. 7,200 horsepower versus 6,345. The most potent reciprocating steam locomotive ever built for passenger service. But before the S1 ever hauled a paying passenger, PRR sent it to the 1939 New York World's Fair, the biggest cultural event in America with nearly 25 million visitors over 2 seasons. Actually getting it there, though, was a logistics nightmare. The S1 was so massive that it couldn't fit through standard rail clearances. Third rail guards had to be physically ripped out along the route. Tight gaps were passed at walking speed with crews on both sides watching every inch, making sure 1 million pounds of locomotive didn't clip something it shouldn't. It had to be towed backwards the entire way by smaller freight engines because there was nowhere along the route to turn it around. They essentially had to reshape the railroad around this one machine just to move it from the factory to a fairground. They built a locomotive so advanced that moving it to its first public appearance required partially dismantling the railroad infrastructure along the way. At the fair, the S1 sat on a roller platform and ran under live steam at 60 miles per hour, 8 hours a day for 2 seasons. By the time the fair closed in October 1940, it had logged 50,000 miles, all without moving an inch. Its image went on calendars, stamps, advertisements, puzzles. Popular mechanics called it the pride of American railroad. The big engine was famous, iconic, and it hadn't even carried a single paying passenger yet. In December 1940, the S1 entered revenue service, and immediately the fundamental problem revealed itself. The Pennsylvania Railroad operated thousands of miles of track, but the S1 could use only a small amount, exactly 283 miles of track, one corridor, Chicago to Crestline, Ohio. That was its entire world. It couldn't negotiate most curves. The 140-foot rigid wheelbase that gave it stability at speed made it terrible at turning. It couldn't fit on a standard turntable. PRR had to extend a roundhouse stall and turn it on a Y track every time it arrived at Crestline, where it kept derailing during the maneuver. It couldn't get through the switch west of Pittsburgh Union Station, which wasn't fixed until 1946. PRR spent $15 million in today's money building the most powerful passenger locomotive in history, then locked it in a 283-mile cage. But inside that cage, the S1 was extraordinary. Mileage reports from the Hagley Library show it logging over 10,000 miles per month, nearly double the K4S average. It hauled PRR's most prestigious trains, the Broadway Limited, the Liberty Limited, the Trailblazer, the General. Crews loved it for its remarkably smooth ride at speed. When World War II drove rail traffic to extreme levels, the S1 became one of the hardest working engines in the fleet. It paid off its entire construction cost within 1 year of wartime service. The historian Alvin Stauffer later wrote that while the S1 was oversized and couldn't handle tight curves, she was an excellent steamer and gave trouble-free service. For 5.5 years, number 6100 ran without a serious accident. But the service record isn't what keeps people talking. What keeps people talking is what happened on those flat, straight stretches between Fort Wayne and Chicago, where speed is everything. Here's what we know for certain. In December 1940, the S1 hit 100.97 miles per hour, pulling 1,350 tons of passenger train. On an April 1941 railfan excursion, it reached 105 miles per hour. Documented, verified, unremarkable for what this machine was designed to do. Then the numbers get weird. In December 1941, Popular Mechanics published Riding the Gargantua of the Rails, citing assistant road foreman Charlie Wapps as recording 133.4 miles per hour with 12 heavyweight cars. If accurate, that beats the Mallard's world record by 7 miles per hour, while pulling a heavier train on regular American track. PRR never filed a claim. In German trade publications from 1945, there was a report citing Interstate Commerce Commission officials that the S1 hit 141.2 miles per hour while making up time on a delayed Trailblazer, 141 miles per hour, 15 faster than the Mallard. And the source isn't anonymous, it's attributed to ICC officials in a published technical journal. Then the wildest claims? 152 miles per hour on the Fort Wayne-Chicago run. PRR fined because steam engines weren't supposed to go that fast. No documentation has ever surfaced. The skeptics have real points. The S1's speed recorder maxed out at 110 miles per hour. Anything above that was one man with a stopwatch timing mileposts. The 133.4 figure comes from Wapes, timing 6.3 miles in 170 seconds. A few seconds of error changes the result dramatically. The 141.2 figure converts to a suspiciously round metric number, suggesting it may have been translated through multiple sources. And nobody seems to have asked what 141 miles per hour would do to the passenger cars. PRR's best business cars were reportedly rough riding at 110. So what do we believe? The S1 was indisputably capable of sustained speeds over 100 miles per hour with heavy trains. The engineering says it could do significantly more. Whether it broke 126 miles per hour, and by how much, remains one of the great unanswered questions in railroad history. And the deepest mystery isn't whether the S1 was fast enough. It's why PRR never tried to prove it. They had the machine. They had the straightaway in Indiana. They had a British record to beat. And in the 1940s, PRR would have loved nothing more than to prove American superiority over the British in railroading. But they never set up an official test, never attached a dynamometer car, never invited the ICC to certify a run, the greatest publicity opportunity in their history, and they walked away from it. By 1945, diesel was coming and even PRR could see it. The S1 was still running. Official reports from December 1945 show number 6100 awaiting truck repairs at Crestline with plans to return to service. But at least 13 T1 class locomotives, smaller, more practical duplexes, were already on the system. The last known record of the S1 in service comes from a personal time book belonging to engineman Byron Breininger. May 5th, 1946. A trip to Chicago, 8:59 a.m. The big engine's final chapter, recorded in pencil by the man at the throttle. PRR's board discussed preserving the S1. It was one of a kind, historically significant, seen by millions, but the railroad's finances were deteriorating. In 1949, number 6100 was scrapped. Raymond Loewy wrote about it decades later. He described standing on a platform watching the S1 approach at 120 miles per hour. It flashed by like a steel thunderbolt, the ground shaking under me in a blast of air that almost sucked me into its whirlwind. That was written in 1979, 30 years after the locomotive was destroyed. He still remembered what it felt like. Nobody gets to feel that anymore. Nobody ever will. The S1 ran for less than 6 years. It only ever worked 283 miles of track, but almost 80 years after it was cut apart, people are still arguing about how fast it went. Still building models of it, still putting its shape in video games and comic books and animated series. The big engine is gone, but the question it left behind is still running.